Have you ever stopped to wonder what actually happens behind closed doors when a narcissist has no one left to perform for? Picture the person who lights up every room they walk into, who commands attention with that strange blend of charm and superiority that seems to come so naturally to them. Now picture that same person, completely alone, showing a side of themselves so stripped of polish, so far removed from the image they project, that it leaves you unsettled and quietly sad at the same time. When the audience disappears, a narcissist's real nature tends to surface, revealing behaviors that most people would never expect from someone who seems so composed and confident in public. Today, we are going deep into one of the more fascinating and uncomfortable corners of personality psychology, the strange and sometimes disturbing things narcissists tend to do when they think nobody is watching. This is not about mocking anyone or turning their pain into a punchline. It is about actually understanding what drives these hidden behaviors, patterns that usually grow out of years of insecurity, emotional manipulation, and a desperate, almost compulsive need to stay in control of how they are perceived. What you are about to learn might genuinely change how you think about narcissism going forward. We are going to walk through these patterns carefully, pulling from clinical psychology, personal observation, and countless real accounts from people who have lived close to this kind of personality. Stick with me to the end as we slowly peel back the layers and take a real look at what happens in the privacy of a narcissist's inner world. A world that looks glamorous and flawless from the outside, but is often filled with strange rituals and unsettling habits once the door closes. These private moments function as both a defense mechanism and a quiet cry for validation, a reflection of just how fractured the narcissist's inner life really is underneath all that polish. This is an exploration of the hidden, often uncomfortable behaviors narcissists show when they believe no one is watching. I want to walk through this with you from a place of curiosity and awareness rather than judgment, because understanding what happens in their private moments gives us real insight into what actually fuels their manipulation, their endless hunger for praise, and the constant internal battles running underneath the surface. Before we dive in, if you find value in this kind of breakdown, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might benefit from understanding these dynamics a little better. Doing that helps build a space centered on truth, empathy, and genuine healing, a space where we can learn together and bring some light to behaviors that usually stay hidden in the shadows. Now let's begin by looking closely at what actually happens once a narcissist no longer has an audience watching them. In solitude, the constant stream of validation they depend on simply vanishes. What is left behind is a quiet war between the mask they wear in public and whoever they actually are underneath it. And it is in that silence that some of their most unsettling habits start to surface. One of the first things worth understanding is their relationship with their own reflection. When left completely alone, a lot of narcissists engage in something that can only really be described as a ritual of self-admiration. They will spend long stretches of time standing in front of a mirror, and this is not just fixing their hair or double-checking their appearance the way most people do. It is an active performance aimed entirely at themselves. They might whisper compliments to their own reflection, recite little affirmations under their breath, pick apart the tiniest imperfections they can find, or record photos and videos specifically to review and analyze later. To anyone watching from the outside, this might look almost comical, maybe even a little sad. But for the narcissist, it functions as a genuinely important ritual. The mirror becomes a kind of silent audience, standing in for the constant admiration they crave but cannot seem to function without. When there is nobody else around to feed their ego, they simply turn that need inward, creating a strange, repetitive loop of self-focus that never quite satisfies them. It is an odd and almost obsessive act, but it says a lot about just how fragile their underlying sense of self-worth actually is. Psychological research on narcissism has consistently shown that this compulsive need to keep reaffirming their own value is one of the defining features of the disorder. In a sense, the mirror becomes a kind of lifeline, a way to keep the illusion of perfection alive even when there is no outside world present to witness it. All that grooming, posing, and self-praise might look vain on the surface, but underneath it is really a desperate attempt to hold together an identity that was built almost entirely on admiration and control. What makes this ritual so revealing is the sheer amount of time and repetition involved. This is not a passing glance in the mirror on the way out the door. It can stretch into long, uninterrupted sessions where the narcissist studies their own face and body from every angle, adjusting their expression, testing different looks, and cataloging which version of themselves feels the most convincing. In a strange way, they are rehearsing for an audience that is not even there yet, preparing the performance they will give the next time someone is actually watching. The mirror does not just reflect their appearance back at them. It becomes a stand-in relationship, one where they get to be both the performer and the admirer at the same time, filling a role that would otherwise be left painfully empty. Once the mirror ritual winds down, another unsettling pattern often kicks in right behind it. A lot of narcissists talk to themselves in private, swinging back and forth between glorifying themselves and tearing themselves apart. This is not gentle, reflective self-talk. It plays out more like a private performance loaded with contradictions. One moment they are bragging out loud about their brilliance, their power, or their charm. The next moment they are cursing themselves out over some small failure, embarrassment, or perceived flaw. Sometimes they even slip into talking about themselves in the third person, as though they are simultaneously the hero and the harshest critic in their own strange internal story. This kind of inner dialogue might sound bizarre from the outside, but it turns out to be remarkably common among people with narcissistic traits. It exposes the exact thing they work so hard to hide, that their grand, confident exterior is frequently just a mask sitting on top of deep, genuinely painful insecurity. Psychologists often describe this as a kind of internal war, a conflict between the idealized self they try to project to the world and the real self they secretly fear and even hate. When they are completely alone, there is nothing left to distract them from that inner conflict, so they end up arguing with themselves, boasting to themselves, and picking themselves apart, all inside the privacy of their own mind. It is both tragic and genuinely unsettling, because it reveals just how unstable their inner world actually is underneath the surface confidence. What is especially striking about this private dialogue is how quickly it can flip from one extreme to the other, sometimes within a matter of minutes. A narcissist might spend several minutes congratulating themselves on how brilliantly they handled a conversation earlier that day, only to spiral moments later into harsh self-criticism over some tiny detail nobody else even noticed. There is rarely a middle ground in this internal conversation, no calm, measured self-assessment the way a psychologically secure person might engage in. It is either triumph or collapse, admiration or contempt, with almost nothing steady holding the two extremes together. That instability is exactly why the public performance has to be so tightly controlled. If their private self-talk swings this wildly when no one is watching, the polished, confident exterior they present to the world is doing an enormous amount of work to keep that chaos hidden from view. But their private life does not stop at mirrors and internal monologues. In today's hyper-connected world, narcissists frequently swap out real, meaningful validation for virtual admiration instead. When they are alone, a lot of them spend hours obsessively scrolling through their own social media, watching closely how people respond to their posts, and constantly comparing themselves to everyone else online. They revisit old photos and old comments, tally up likes and shares, and sometimes even quietly monitor the profiles of people who once admired them, or just as often, people who once criticized them. This kind of behavior can become genuinely addictive, a toxic loop of hope followed by disappointment on repeat. Every notification gives them a brief little high. Every silence or lack of response feels like outright rejection. And because their sense of self-worth depends so heavily on outside praise, they end up trapped inside this digital loop of constant checking and emotional whiplash. Researchers studying this dynamic have found that social media can be especially damaging for people with narcissistic traits, precisely because it feeds exactly what they crave most: attention, envy, and a sense of control, all while quietly deepening the emptiness they are actually trying to escape from in the first place. So when a narcissist is alone, their phone essentially becomes a second mirror, and the endless scrolling becomes its own quiet form of self-inflicted torment. There is a particular kind of restlessness that comes with this behavior too, a compulsive quality where the checking never actually resolves anything. Even a flood of positive attention rarely satisfies them for long, because the underlying hunger driving the behavior was never really about any single post or comment. It is about needing constant proof that they still matter, that they are still relevant, that the world has not quietly moved on without them. So the scrolling continues long after it stops being enjoyable, turning into something closer to a compulsion than a choice, one more private habit that looks glamorous from the outside but feels hollow from the inside. Another dark and genuinely unsettling behavior that shows up when narcissists are left alone is fantasizing about revenge. They replay specific moments where they felt embarrassed or rejected, and they imagine detailed ways to take back control of the situation. These revenge fantasies can get remarkably elaborate. They might picture full confrontations, imagine victories, or even the suffering of the people they hold responsible for their pain. Sometimes they will actually write these fantasies down or record angry voice memos that no one will ever hear or listen to. These private acts of imagined rage give them a sense of power in moments when they otherwise feel completely powerless. It becomes their own quiet way of rewriting the story in their favor, even if that rewrite only ever exists inside their own head. Psychological research consistently shows that narcissists are unusually sensitive to rejection and criticism, and that their anger tends to linger far longer than most people's does. When they are alone, with nobody left to impress or perform for, that suppressed anger tends to turn inward and simmer, feeding obsessive and sometimes disturbing thought patterns. These fantasies may never actually turn into real actions, but they reveal just how much resentment and hostility sits underneath that charming public exterior. What makes these fantasies especially unsettling is how disconnected from reality they can become. The narcissist does not see the original situation the way an outside observer would. Instead, they rewrite it inside their own mind until they become both the hero and the victim of the story simultaneously. This internal narrative protects their fragile ego, but it also isolates them further from the actual world around them. When their need for control and validation collides head-on with a deep fear of failure, their inner world essentially becomes a battlefield. Their solitude, which could otherwise be a space for genuine reflection or healing, instead becomes a stage for self-worship, simmering rage, and endless mental rehearsals of revenge that never actually get resolved. There is something almost theatrical about how detailed these private rehearsals can become. The narcissist does not simply think about the person who hurt or embarrassed them in passing. They script entire scenes, sometimes replaying the same imagined confrontation over and over, with slightly different endings each time, always landing on a version where they come out on top. It is a form of control they cannot actually exercise in real life, so they manufacture it inside their own head instead, where the outcome is always guaranteed and the humiliation always belongs to someone else. It is a genuinely painful cycle, and it is one that most narcissists never manage to break, mainly because they cannot bring themselves to admit it even exists in the first place. Shallow praise from others tends to keep them hooked, constantly replaying moments where they felt insulted, dismissed, or criticized. This ongoing mental replay becomes its own form of emotional self-punishment, a way of keeping old wounds alive and fresh inside their mind. Even as these memories chip away at their already fragile self-worth, they simply cannot let them go. They might spend hours scrolling back through old messages, rewatching old recordings, or writing down every perceived slight in obsessive, exhausting detail. This fixation on old pain is not quiet reflection. It is an active, ongoing cycle that feeds their anger and deepens their bitterness over time. Psychological research on this kind of rumination shows it tends to create a vicious downward spiral, where every remembered insult grows larger with each replay, becoming more and more proof in their own mind that they are always the one being wronged. For a narcissist, this kind of emotional self-torment becomes a strange, twisted form of validation. It keeps alive the story they tell themselves, that the world has treated them unfairly, and that they are the true victim in every scenario. Even though this belief is deeply distorted, it becomes a core piece of their identity that they cling to tightly. This kind of rumination also tends to feed itself in a way that makes it especially hard to interrupt. Because the narcissist rarely processes these old wounds with anyone else, there is no outside voice available to offer perspective or gently challenge the story they keep replaying. Left entirely to their own devices, the memory gets rehearsed so many times that it eventually stops resembling what actually happened and starts resembling whatever version best supports their sense of grievance. Over months and years, this private editing process can leave them carrying around an entire internal history that is only loosely connected to real events, one where they are almost always the wronged party and almost never the one who caused any harm. In private, the last major disturbing behavior narcissists often show is a kind of secret self-glorification carried out through distorted self-talk and repetitive ritual like habits. When they are completely alone, away from anyone's eyes, they often run through small routines designed to prop up their fragile ego. This can include extended mirror gazing, ongoing self-praise, or carefully arranging their surroundings to match some perfect image they hold of themselves in their own mind. Sometimes they drift off into detailed fantasies about future success, imagined victories, or getting revenge on the people who once doubted them. These private behaviors usually come paired with an inner voice that exaggerates their own greatness far beyond reality. Their internal dialogue sounds confident on the surface, but it carries a faint undertone of fear and insecurity running just beneath it. The need to keep reinforcing their own worth becomes almost like an addiction, something they genuinely cannot seem to stop doing even when it exhausts them. Every small action feels like proof of their own importance in the moment, and yet every quiet pause also reminds them of just how empty they feel deep down. This kind of private self-worship might look absurd, maybe even a little sad to anyone watching from the outside. But in truth, it is a deep and genuinely unsettling sign of just how completely self-deception and old emotional damage have taken over their inner life. When you step back and look closely at these 6 disturbing patterns narcissists tend to show when they are alone: the constant self-admiration, the conflict-filled inner dialogue, the obsessive digital checking, the vengeful daydreaming, the harmful rumination they use as coping, and the ritualistic self-glorification. What becomes clear is that these are not just quirky personal habits. They are symptoms of real emotional pain and genuine inner instability. Each behavior, however unpleasant it might look from the outside, offers a window into the narcissist's complicated inner world, a person caught between an inflated public image and a private world quietly filled with torment. From a psychological standpoint, these actions function as unhealthy coping mechanisms, patterns learned over years shaped by manipulation, rejection, and unmet needs for genuine attention and connection. Clinical research also shows that people with strong narcissistic traits tend to experience real emotional chaos when they are left by themselves. The behaviors we see surfacing in their solitude are often the raw, unfiltered expression of that inner suffering. And while these behaviors can look genuinely awful from the outside, they can also serve as signals not necessarily of malice, but of deep, unresolved pain sitting underneath. A narcissist's actions, no matter how unpleasant they appear, are frequently reflections of old emotional wounds and an endless, exhausting effort to maintain a mask of perfection. In a lot of ways, these disturbing habits function as silent cries for help. Behind all the arrogance and the need for control sits a person who, in truth, is often deeply unhappy and quietly afraid. It is worth sitting with that idea for a moment, because it changes the way you might approach anyone in your own life who shows these patterns. None of this excuses the harm narcissistic behavior can cause to the people around them. Understanding where a behavior comes from is not the same thing as accepting it, and empathy for someone's inner pain does not require you to keep absorbing the damage that pain produces. But there is real value in seeing the fuller picture, in recognizing that the person who seems so untouchable in public is often waging a private war they never talk about and rarely even admit to themselves. Understanding these behaviors offers real insight into the inner world of people struggling with narcissistic traits. They act as warning signs, but they can also serve as potential entry points for healing if the person is ever willing to look at them honestly. Understanding these hidden patterns is the first real step toward addressing the pain sitting underneath them. It is a reminder that even the most destructive actions usually come from deep, often unhealed human experiences somewhere in that person's past. Recognizing these behaviors in someone with narcissistic tendencies can also work as a powerful tool for protecting yourself. If you happen to be close to someone who shows these kinds of unpleasant private habits, whether in a personal relationship or a professional setting, it helps to remember that their behavior is not actually about you. It comes from their own internal chaos, not from anything you did or failed to do. Building that kind of awareness helps you set clearer boundaries and protect your own emotional well-being going forward. That might look like seeking support from a mental health professional, making your own boundaries clear and consistent, or, when it becomes necessary, stepping away from the toxic dynamic altogether. Doing that protects your own peace and, in a small way, contributes to a world that understands a little better how trauma and insecurity can quietly twist someone's behavior over time. In the end, these 6 disturbing things narcissists tend to do when they are alone: excessive self-admiration, conflicted inner dialogue, obsessive digital monitoring, revenge-based daydreaming, harmful self-coping through rumination, and ritualistic self-glorification reveal the raw, messy truth sitting underneath the mask most of us only ever see in public. They point to a hidden world filled with restlessness, insecurity, and quiet suffering. These are not just odd little quirks. They are the echoes of an entire lifetime spent chasing validation and control, never quite catching either one. They remind us of a sobering truth, that every single one of these actions, even the most unpleasant, is part of a person's ongoing struggle to carry the unbearable weight of their own self-image. By shining a light on these patterns, we gain not just a better understanding of narcissistic psychology, but also a bit more power to recognize the harm these behaviors cause and hopefully start moving toward genuine healing, both for the people who live with narcissistic traits and for the people who love them. Thank you for sticking with me through this deep dive into the 6 disturbing things narcissists tend to do when nobody is watching. Your time and attention genuinely mean a lot. If this exploration has helped you understand these hidden patterns a little more clearly, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing it with someone else who might get something out of it too. Your support helps build a community grounded in empathy, self-awareness, and real healing. I would love to hear your own thoughts and experiences in the comments so we can keep this conversation going together. Together, we can keep exploring the connection between trauma, self-image, and the secret rituals of people who hide behind a mask of superiority. Thank you again for being here with me. I look forward to seeing you in future conversations as we continue exploring topics centered on recovery, emotional strength, and lasting inner peace.